The next historical era after the Archaic period was the Woodland period, which lasted a couple of thousand years and can be divided into different sections. Generally, when someone talks about the Woodland period or the Woodland era pertaining to Native Americans, they're usually talking about the cultures of those tribes that are designated Eastern Woodland Indians. For the most part, east of the Mississippi, all the tribes east of the Mississippi, and a little ways trans-Mississippi, as you can see here in the map. But the plains area also had its woodland period, even though there were not heavy woods in the area. They didn't quite match up exactly chronologically with the larger woodland period of the east. And, other regions, if you go farther west, differed. Like the desert southwestern tribes did not have a woodland period per se. But when talking about the woodland period, it's important, if we're discussing the plains tribes, it's important to understand the culture, particularly of that area along the banks on both sides of the Mississippi River and the Ohio River, because if you will recall that earlier map we looked at a few lectures ago, when we talked about how a lot of tribes that we associate historically with the Great Plains actually came there from somewhere else within a few hundred years before European contact. And if you'll notice, the majority of them came from the east and came from that woodland, eastern woodland area. Quite a few there from the area of Illinois and Missouri, and then quite a few from the Great Lakes region that now we associate. If you know anything about these tribes, you will associate them with the Great Plains, like the Sioux, the Lakota, and the other branches of the Sioux, Nakota, and the Cheyenne. So they came with them, or they came out onto the plains after the end of that woodland period. So obviously they brought elements of that culture with them. And so there's going to be a lot of cultural elements on the Great Plains that's from the woodland area, even though it's not necessarily wooded. All right. Well, that was a bit long-winded. Let's move on and look at the woodland period in the east. Easy to remember the names of the three subdivisions of the woodland period: early, middle, and late. The overall span in the east of the woodland period was roughly 1,000 years BCE to 1,000 years CE. And by the way, a lot of times I just assume people know what I'm talking about. But if you're watching this you're hearing these terms BCE and CE, it's the same dates as BC and AD, but with a non-religious context before the Common Era and the Common Era. So the early woodland period was from 1000 BCE to about 200 BCE. And during that time, the big, particularly noteworthy thing was that there was a widespread use of pottery. Now, the beginning of the woodland period, the end of the Archaic and into the beginning of the woodland period, was the transition to actual sedentary agriculture. These bands starting to purposely set about trying to grow things in a certain area. And pottery is something that really kind of is an outgrowth of that and helps to then further advance that, right? Because you can store things like seeds or like foodstuffs a lot more efficiently and a lot more safely for a lot longer time with pottery than you could with, say, for example, woven baskets, which had already become a thing during the Archaic period. The Middle Woodland period, from about 200 BCE to about the beginning of the 6th century, 500 CE. During that time, there arose a complex trade network throughout the eastern woodland world that was pretty far-reaching, and like I said, fairly complex. It arose, and then it began to decline in the beginning of the late Woodland Period. The late Woodland Period, from about 500 CE to 1000 CE, saw a period of intensified agriculture, introduction to the eastern woodlands, things that had originally been sort of worked with and developed in south of the border in Mexico, down into Central and South America, particularly in Mexico, maize or corn and beans as well. Things that were sort of purposely, I guess you could say, engineered by generations of farmers until they blended just the right mixture of wild grains to get a domestic grain that was able to sustain a pretty good population. So once that entered into the woodland region, into the what's now the United States, in the eastern area, then there was significant population growth at that time. Now, over on the Great Plains, those people who were living there, and there were more than there had, that kind of had gone up and down. We've talked about that. But the Plains Woodland Period was about 1,000 years. It was about 1,000 years late, essentially, after it had started in the east. And then from that point, it just kind of mirrored the timing of the Eastern Woodland Period. Ended around the same time, so about 1,000 years. And one of the things that developed during that time was the use of barbed heads for spears, darts, and later arrows. Arrows got invented. Bows and arrows were invented during the late Woodland Period. Now this is, 3,000 years after they had been invented in the Eastern Hemisphere, but they did come along, and that may have actually, the invention of the bow and arrow may have been part of the reason for the decline of that big trade network, because once the bow and arrow became widely available, then it was a lot easier to hunt, and some areas became overhunted, and resources kind of dwindled there so far as game. And then also the competition that arose over the course of the development of this trade network sometimes led to conflict. And it may not seem like a huge technological development to move up to the bow and arrow from the spear, but it actually it was, and you could kill a lot more people more quickly. And so this may have led to the increase in warfare there around the end of that middle Woodland Period, beginning of the late Woodland Period. So sometimes the development of these sedentary lifestyles during the Woodland Period, or sometimes it's called the Neolithic Revolution, they really are, for the most part, sedentary. The villages are permanent or semi-permanent. Usually the villages would be built near rivers so as to have a good water source, obviously. During the Woodland Period, the early and middle, by the middle Woodland Period, there was pumpkins and squash and sunflowers were grown, purposefully cultivated. There was evidence of social stratification, which is what happens once you get a sedentary lifestyle and move away from being hunters and gatherers, and once you start producing things on a regular basis. there's going to reach a point where some people have more of these things than others, and that's going to lead to the development of social class. And there's evidence of that during the Woodland period. Of course, we talked already about pottery and how that helped with moving and storing food. And I think we talked a little bit earlier about the fact that without having to constantly be on the move, migrating in a nomadic fashion, following the game, following the animals, without having to be full-time hunter-gatherers, like you get up in the morning and then you spend all day trying to get something to eat, and then it's time to go to bed and get ready to do the same thing tomorrow. With the development of agriculture and permanent villages, that gave more time to people. People had more free time to spend thinking and developing new things like art and religion and ritual. So, not surprisingly, burial rituals became even more kind of complex than they had become during the Archaic period. And also, now that these villages, for the most part, are sedentary, or at least quasi-sedentary. In some cases, you'd have tribes who would build a town and stay there for several years until the soil had been depleted with the agriculture. Then they would basically pick up their town, or tear it down and move it down the road a few miles and set up again, and kind of travel in a route that way. It's still roughly, the same area, and it's going to be in the same place for several years. So you might as well say sedentary. Then it's possible to have burial grounds, cemeteries. The burials that had taken place during the Paleo-Indian period, in particular, that because they were always on the move, somebody died. If they were buried, it was done pretty close to where they had died. If you will recall, by the way, this is an image here of a plains burial site. Some tribes later on in the plains would not actually bury their dead under the ground, which was what most tribes east of the Mississippi and in other areas did, but would rather put them up on these high scaffolds so as to expose them for the birds, in the kind of the belief of the cycle of life, right? All these various animals, including the birds, have fed you, and now it's your turn. But if you will recall, when we talked about horn shelter man, that probably a shaman, medicine man, and his assistant or his apprentice, who were found buried in Texas in that circular hole, it was under a big rock overhang. And during the Paleo-Indian period, that's where burials tended to take place, was underneath these overhanging rocks like this, or in caves, actually in caves. I suppose possibly with an idea of being closer to the lower world, or the underworld. But once you've got sedentary villages and people are able to, over the course of generations, have the same area as a place to bury their dead, then that becomes really, in a way, a part of your identity, right? Because those are your ancestors are just down the road. You can go see where they're buried. Another thing that started to become common during the Woodland era was the building of mounds. And that had actually gotten started sort of at the tail end of the Archaic era. And the oldest mounds that have been discovered, probably, are actually in Louisiana, several of them in northeast Louisiana. And As to why they were built, there are various ideas, hypotheses, theories. Some people have theorized that these earthen structures were kind of built there, and that buildings were built on top of them. So maybe it was for towns, or maybe it was for temporary hunting camps. Maybe it was to make sure you stayed above water during the rainy season. Those oldest mounds that I mentioned, somewhere between 1700 and 1100 BCE is when they went up. Other theories are that they were used as a place where people met for trade, like, a place to have like a bazaar. One theory is that they had purely a ritual purpose, and certainly later on in various cultures, mounds wound up being used as locations, sort of the epicenters of religious and social ceremony. And then later as well, some cultures began to bury people in the mounds, but all mounds were not burial mounds. And we'll actually talk a little bit more about the mounds here in just a minute. So just kind of recap some of the big things that happened during the Woodland period. Pottery, we talked about. The introduction of the bow and arrow, which really was revolutionary. And also the introduction of things like maize and beans, which had originally been cultivated in previous centuries in Mexico and had sort of made its way up into the what is now the United States. All right, well, now let's look at some particular cultures that were around during and right after the Woodland period that are going to have an impact eventually on the plains. And we're going to do that by looking at three cultural networks which existed at separate times from one another, were not directly related to each other, but were very, very similar, and sort of had each successive cultural complex a wider range and a bigger impact. And oddly enough, the first two, and part of the third one as well, just happened to be all throughout modern-day Ohio, with a little bit of spillover into some of the surrounding states around Ohio. So you had the Adena culture, and by the way, all these cultures that are mentioned on this slide are basically named after the towns, the modern-day towns or locations where the first archaeological ruins were found of these cultures. So you had the Adena culture in the early Woodland period, from roughly 800 BCE, so that wasn't very far into the early Woodland period, to about 100 AD, so just slightly into the middle Woodland period. Then you've got the Hopewell cultural complex, which roughly about 200 BCE, so about 100 years after the decline of the Adena, for about 3 centuries to about 500 AD. Then we skip the rest of the Woodland era, and we'll pick up with a much, much larger and more complex system called the Mississippiian culture, which included as part of it the Fort Ancient culture there in Ohio. All right, well, the earliest one, the Adena culture, was none of these, by the way, they weren't all necessarily the same group of people. They weren't necessarily the same language group, so far as we know, but they had certain cultural characteristics which they shared. So the Adena culture had a lot of different motifs, a lot of different artistic themes that would become not only spread throughout their culture and sort of be passed down to the Hopewell, but through the Mississippian complex be spread across a very wide area and become very, very common among Native Americans. The images in question include the weeping eye, which is up there in the upper right-hand corner. You see that in a lot of different cultures. The circle and cross in the lower right-hand corner, and that's going to play a large part in some of the cultures in the plains, especially in the northern plains. And yet also it wound up being commonly used throughout the American South, but originated, at least as far as we can tell, earliest examples of it in the Adena culture. And when we get to talking about that imagery among the Lakotas, we'll talk about what that means. Pipes that had bowls made of what's called pipestone, or also is called catlinite. It's kind of a red, sort of hardened clay material. Catlinite being named for George Catlin, an American artist in the 1800s who traveled around the American West painting American Indians. Catlinite is found, I'm not sure if it's only, but largely in Minnesota. And as early as the Adena culture, there were native peoples in what is now Minnesota mining this material and trading it so that it could be used in pipes actually in other areas, and still commonly used in Native American pipes today. Another common motif was humans that were in the process of turning into animals, shapeshifters. You see that a lot in the artwork of the Adena period, including sometimes in the carved pipe bowls. All right, so after that you had the Hopewell interaction sphere. The Hopewell complex we saw earlier was roughly a slightly larger area in Ohio, but here you can see that Ohio Hopewell area and all the other cultural spheres around the eastern half of the U.S. and up into Canada with whom they interacted. And some of these areas are also called Hopewell because their cultures are very similar to those of the Hopewell in Ohio. And in part, that's because that culture was spreading through the trade networks. Now, the Hopewell, sort of the height of their influence was from about the years 200 to 500 CE, which, as it turns out, when we talked earlier about the Middle Woodland period, is when that very elaborate trade system developed. So when you have a complex, far-reaching trade system, then yes, you get trade goods from one region being found later in other regions very far away because of that, but you also have ideas from one region, perhaps artistic themes, or perhaps spiritual ideas that also travel along those trade routes and take hold with other peoples. So as you can see, this is pretty far spread here, the Hopewell interaction sphere. Here is a painting called Hopewell Harvest, and both the Adena and the Hopewell built mounds. And so this is a Hopewell mound, and you have the people of the village working probably in the common cornfield that they held in common that everyone worked in. All right. Well, after the end of the Woodland period, which ended around the same time both in the eastern woodlands and in the Great Plains, then you had the rise of Mississippian culture, and that first map that we looked at that had the Adena and the Hopewell overlaid also had the Fort Ancient culture in Ohio. That was the Ohio iteration of Mississippian culture. Even more closely connected trade routes and even more closely connected cultural similarities, particularly where ceremony was concerned. So it's called Mississippian because some of the early examples that were discovered by archaeologists were along the Mississippi Valley. But as you can see here, you've got not only all up and down the Mississippi River, but you've got almost all the American South. You've got a big chunk of the Midwest there in Ohio, as well as in Missouri. You've got most of Louisiana. Up in the north, you have the Oneota cultural complex, which is the one that spread out into or almost up to the edges of the northern plains, and which included parts of Minnesota and Iowa, and into some parts of modern-day North and South Dakota and Nebraska. And then the Caddoan Mississippian culture, in which, the Caddoan was also a language group. The Caddo was a tribe. They're in East Texas, eastern Oklahoma, part of Arkansas. In Louisiana, you later had a tribe that was very influential in the area called the Natchez or the Natchez. Remember the Natchez and the Caddo. We'll be talking about them again in just a minute. So, all throughout this Mississippian cultural area, you had these very complex hierarchical societies, often with hereditary rulers, often with both the religious and the political leadership sort of intermixed and inseparable. And here is a painting from one of those Appalachian Mississippian towns, in which you can see this group of probably political and religious leaders who are standing way high up on top of a flattened mound, which overlooks the town. And you'll notice that the guy over on the right is holding that sign that is the cross or the plus sign in a circle. I said we'd explain that later, but I'll just go ahead. Essentially, the four arms of that cross represent the four winds or the four directions. Remember how important that is, all the way back to the Archaic period. And the fact that they're enclosed by a circle means that they're all connected together. Everything is connected. That's what that means. Well, in Mississippian towns, and remember, this is not just in Mississippi. This is almost the entire South, a big chunk of the Midwest, part of the Northern Plains, all the way up to the edge of the Southern Plains. You had these mounds that sometimes were huge and dominated the whole town. So people would come before the mound when there were going to be ceremonies or announcements or whatever. And like I said, it was extremely hierarchical. Now, native culture from the time that English colonists encountered native peoples in Virginia and started going inland, not so hierarchical, but in some ways it kind of sort of was. And we'll see in a little bit just exactly why that was and how it happened to turn out that way. But a lot of this culture, this Mississippian culture, is going to be carried forward in some, sometimes in subtle ways, sometimes in not so subtle ways. One really good example of a Mississippian, masterpiece of a town was the town of Cahokia, which was in southern Illinois, right near the Missouri border. Was a huge town that was dominated by a bunch of different mounds, and at its peak may have had as many as 40,000 people living in it. So that's roughly from somewhere around 600 CE up to 1400 CE. So about 150 years before the Europeans came into the area, Cahokia had already sort of dropped out of the picture. But for a long time, it was a trade hub. That's why it became so big. It was a big trade hub. All the different trade routes came through there. Spiro in modern-day Oklahoma was a smaller example of a trade hub. It's theorized that the reason Cahokia was abandoned is because it got so big that population was no longer sustainable from the resources in that area. So they broke off into smaller groups. So, very hierarchical cultures, sometimes with hereditary leaders, social classes, with towns that were dominated by huge, flattened mounds. In many ways, that sounds like what we would normally associate with Mexico, Central and South America, with the Aztecs, and in fact was very similar. That trade network, the Mississippian trade network, extended down into Mexico, and there was some cultural exchange of imagery even that the Aztecs had in common with some of the, for example, tribes of the southeast. And when the Spanish first arrived inland along the coast of the Gulf Coast there, many of the tribes they encountered were in fact structured similarly to what we would associate with some of those Central American tribes, not what we would tend to think of as the tribes of the what was later the United States. And in particular, this is going to be an important expedition, more ways than one, as it turns out. Hernando de Soto in 1540 headed into the American Southeast, and you can see his route there, which started in Florida and headed toward Texas. De Soto himself didn't make it the whole way; he wound up being killed. But the tribes that they encountered throughout what is now the Carolinas and Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi, also they were Mississippian cultures, and they had the mounds, they had the very strict hierarchies. But in the wake of De Soto, that was a 2-year journey that his expedition took through the American South. In their wake was massive death and destruction. It's been called by anthropologists the Mississippi Shatter Zone, and it was the microbes, it was the disease that the Spanish were carrying with them and their livestock, which they didn't even know existed. They didn't know there was such a thing as germs or microbes, but the native peoples had no resistance to them. And so as De Soto and his group traveled through the American South, after they left, then you had huge numbers of people dying. And it wasn't even always the people who had met De Soto, because that expedition might encounter one group and give them these diseases, and then they interact with other groups and it spreads. So there were whole tribes and nations that were either completely wiped out or were decimated. And in the decades and the century that followed, the survivors of many of those groups came together with survivors from other groups and created what are called coalescent groups, new tribes, essentially, and started over from scratch. And when those tribes were encountered much later by other Europeans, after the Spanish came through, the English didn't make it inland for 150 years after that. And so the cultures that they encountered were very much more communitarian, egalitarian, people sort of all working together, didn't have the social classes at all, didn't have hereditary leadership at all. Leadership was something that was done by kind of like consent of the people. Leaders were chosen. However, all the way into the 1700s and up into the early 1800s, there were a couple of cultures still that held on to some of the vestiges of the Mississippian tradition. And they were the Natchez and the Caddo, located, if you will recall, in Louisiana and up into parts of East Texas and Arkansas. And if you'll notice there, that's part of the area that DeSoto didn't make it into. So they didn't suffer as badly. And so they still had hereditary leaders, for example. The hereditary leader of the Natchez or Nache was known as the Great Sun. That's S-U-N. And still the principal leader of the Nache people, is known as the Great Sun. I'm friends with him on Facebook, actually. Actually, I've talked with him several times beyond that. But anyhow, that's why those vestiges remained of the Mississippian culture. And again, remember that Caddo connection, because we're going to be touching on that again in just a little while.